With the fruit of the Spirit, it's the fruit of God's Spirit in our lives. It's what a life submitted and open to God naturally looks like. And so our work is to say, how do I get out of the way? How do I tend to the soil? How do I make space? For me, it's way more, how do I stop fighting what God keeps planting in my life?
Hey, thanks for checking out Word Made Digital podcast on YouTube. My name is Joanna and I'm the host of Word Made Digital, and this season, season 6, is all about the fruit of the Spirit. We're looking at what is the character behind the things that we do as creatives and communicators and leaders in ministry. So, thank you so much to Compassion Canada and to waybase.com for making this whole season possible. I want you to check out who they are in the links below. But for now, enjoy this video, enjoy this episode, and after you're done, check out tutorials, videos, podcasts, all the other stuff that we have as resources here on YouTube. Aaron Niequist, welcome to Word Made Digital. I'm really pumped to have you on the podcast today. Thanks for joining.
Thanks so much for inviting me.
I would love to know about New York in the pandemic. Can we start there? You're living in a place we're watching on the news from a lot of other places. Tell me what that's been like. Let's just start there. How's it been the last year and a half?
Well, it two things. One, it was super scary. It was really intense. I mean, if you can remember back to late February and then early March, and we're hearing all these reports, and they're talking about martial law, and they're going to shut down the city, and all these kinds of things.
Well, and we're seeing like mass graves being dug.
Oh yeah, yeah. It was, so intense, and so my wife is a lot smarter than me. You'll learn that if I talk about her at all. She's way smarter, and she was like, you know what? What if we just rent a car and get out of the city for a week or two, just to wait and see how serious this is going to be? And so her family has a tiny little place in Michigan. So we said, let's go, crash there for 2 weeks. And we came back 5 months later.
5 months? 2 weeks was 5 months.
And so we have we stayed really connected with our friends who were living here in the city, and about half of them got COVID in that first round, and a couple of them were really, really bad. And then right when it was opening up a little bit, we were going to come home, but then that's when it started getting good in Michigan weather-wise. So we're like, well, why would we come back to New York?
Like summer was starting,
So the timing ended up being a little weird. So in some ways, it was really beautiful to get out of the city. In other ways, we felt like sellouts. Like, oh man,
you're not real New. I guess, are you real New Yorkers? No, I mean it's. Whatever that means.
Yeah. But we were really grateful to be able to get out of the city, and honestly, we were so glad to get back. We love it here, and even when we came back, this fall has been pretty intense also, and we actually our pod all got COVID.
Oh, you got COVID?
Oh yeah.
Oh,
one friend did a work trip, came home, got 3 negative tests, but we found out it takes 5 days to show up. So he came back, and we welcomed him, and then we all got it. So it's been intense. But I think just yesterday or the day before, New York opened fully, and it's like a party in the streets. It's really, really fun.
And
right now.
When open fully, so Toronto here where I am has had the longest lockdown for sure in North America and possibly the world. And we have, provinces, not states. So our provincial leader, I think he thinks this is like a badge of honor, and the people are like, we want to die. It's horrible, So tell me what it's like on the other side. What is like the feeling in the air over there?
Well, I don't want to tell you because I don't want to rub it in. But, to be honest, I find myself on a pretty conservative side of, not conservative politically, conservative on the pandemic. I I really see mask wearing as loving our neighbors. I really see that, of course, shutdown itself has real negative consequences, but not as negative as dying. So in the States, we had 600,000 deaths. And so this has just been
because it just was quite a different response in most other countries.
Yeah.
That shut down for a long periods of time. It was a different approach.
And we just, I don't know if you knew, but America is slightly divided right now.
might have heard something about that.
And so we just, it was pretty rough. But on this side of it, man, it's quite beautiful.
Wow. Well, and in general, I mean, this is maybe we're going to talk about fruits of the Spirit as like a general theme of this whole series of the podcast of Word Made Digital podcast. But so you're even already kind of pulling at some threads that we should probably explore, like how do we loving our neighbors, and when there's divisive issues and all this stuff. But before we get there, I'll sit in New York a little longer, just because I'm a city girl. I live right in the downtown heart of my own city, and I'm high in the sky in a tower, and but also one thing we share in common is that we both have spent some time. We are still there, I believe, in in the heart of a busy modern city, in sort of this seminary, old historic place. I lived at Wycliffe College here in Toronto, the Anglican seminary. So tell me, how is what is this life that you're living over there? Give us a picture of it.
Yeah. What is this life that we're living? Well, I just graduated a couple weeks ago from General Theological Seminary, and I got a Master's of Arts in Ministry. And basically, I've been in church work. I think I did 19 years full-time church work, and then took this little, I don't know if it's a sabbatical or little mini pause, and it wasn't for the degree as much as I just want to keep learning. There's so many things I don't know. And I told Shauna, my wife, right before I started, I said, I want people to make me read books that I'd never find on my own. Because I'd been doing a lot of reading and learning, but only things that were interesting to me. And so some of the things I was made to read, I'm glad to never think about that again. But a number of things, I was like, this is brilliant. This is beautiful. This is so helpful. So, so just graduated, and we're still living at the seminary in the Chelsea neighborhood of Manhattan.
And do they kick you out now? How does that work? If you've graduated, do you have to leave?
Well, you can live on campus. There's a way to. You don't have to be a student to live on campus. But I'm actually talking with the seminary to stay on for kind of a short-term worship-related project. So that will actually be really fun.
Oh, how intriguing!
Yeah,
that's exciting. I know there. When I lived at the college, there were some people who were somehow, I don't know how they were able to stay for years after they finished school. Maybe just there was space. I don't know how it worked, but they had family housing, and some families just hunkered down, and it was so affordable in the middle of the city to live. For us, it's the most expensive city in our country, so they wanted to stay as long as possible.
Absolutely, yes.
I love that. I mean, New York is iconic in so many ways, but most people don't get to live there. Most of us enter as a tourist.
Absolutely. We feel like almost every day we say, I feel like we've won the lottery. How do we get to do this? I mean,
that's cool.
We're those cheesy New Yorkers who are still enamored with it every day. Can you believe this beautiful? So some of our longer term New York friends are like, all right, but we're just loving it.
Well, a mutual friend of ours, Tim Schrader, he was on this podcast a few years ago. I don't know. I'd have to go figure out what episode that was. But he also did the move to New York a few years ago, and calls himself a New Yorker now, and chose to stay through the pandemic, although he could have left, and felt like he needed to stay. It was something about hunkering down. I don't know. yeah, there's something that gets in your under your skin about a city like that, and it's a character in the story as much as the people that there. Yeah. Okay, so you call yourself a liturgist, or at least you have in the past called yourself a liturgist. Most people listening to this podcast don't have a background in like a very liturgical thing. So let's start there. Yeah. What does that even mean?
Yeah.
What is a liturgist?
What a good question. Well, my job description has always said worship leader.
Huh. Okay.
And but that I'm realizing in our collective imaginations, worship leader almost always means the person who leads 4 pop songs in a hymn, the song leader, and that's a huge.
Well, they got to pray after the third
song.
That's
right.
Too.
They have to pray to transition to the offering, and that's a huge part of it. And actually, I love leading songs and leading hymns and inviting us to sing. I think that's beautiful work. But this happened probably about 15 years ago when I was a worship leader at Mars Hill Church in Grand Rapids, Michigan. We started realizing at that time, Rob Bell was the preacher, and he was just talking about God and the kingdom and the church in these really expansive words and language and vision. And I realized all I have are these rock songs. And they were good, but they couldn't capture the width and the depth of this kind of kingdom vision that we were talking about as a church. And so I just started exploring, like, well, how do other people do it? How do other traditions do it? I was taught that, Catholics, they're not even Christians. And, everybody else was kind of wrong except us. But the more I explored and the more I was learning from these other traditions, even when there'd be points of disagreement, there was such profound wisdom. And so at Mars Hill, we began incorporating other kinds of worship, whether it would be a reading or a moment of guided silence or prayer for the world. Or one of the big ones was a confession. Almost every Christian tradition, every time they gather as a community, have a moment of confession, of naming ways that we've fallen short of love. But not just I thought you meant the creed. I don't confession of belief. Yeah. But yes, that too. Definitely the creed. But I was talking about a confession of sin, and
right.
And so all these different aspects, I was realizing like our tradition, my tradition, was quite impoverished. We did one thing spectacularly well, but there were all these other things that we didn't even engage in. And I was explaining this to my wife. Remember, she's way smarter than me, and she was asking why.
But it comes from a similar tradition.
Comes from very similar tradition.
Yeah.
And she was saying, why? Help me understand, why are we doing all these other things during the, quote unquote worship set? And I tried to explain it, and I was kind of and finally she said, "Oh, so basically you're trying to serve a well-balanced meal every Sunday." And I said, "Oh my, that's precisely. I've been serving one single meal every Sunday for the last 10 years, wondering why our community isn't getting healthier." And so we kind of shifted to say, well, to take this analogy a little farther, what are the food groups that our community never gets, that we're a little bit impoverished? And how can I include those into our worship gathering? And so all that, very long way to say, in that way, it kind of shifted from seeing it as a worship set, 5 songs, to a, I didn't use the word liturgical because it has so much baggage for so many of us, but kind of a journey together, a worship journey that we would go on together. And
what are you finding? I mean, this is now, you've been doing this for a long time. When people are entering into this kind of approach, a mix of style, or a balanced diet of things.
Yeah.
What are they responding with? Is this new to them? Is this something they used to do at another church? Like
Yeah.
what's sort of the what's
a
the
great question.
what's the consumer feedback?
Yeah, consumer feedback. Well, I'll tell you this. After Mars Hill, I moved back to Chicago to be a worship leader at Willow Creek Church. And I made the, I don't know if it was mistake or naive attempt or whatever. I wanted to bring all this to the weekend service at Willow Creek, which if for those listening, if you're not familiar, is kind of a very like seeker-focused megachurch type thing. Yeah, if you close your eyes and imagine what a megachurch is, that's kind of the thing. And it does many things well, but wasn't always open to those kinds of things. But I was persistent, and so whenever we do anything that felt Catholic to people, after the service, I'd have 3 lines of people, and the first line was those who grew up just in the evangelical church. And we're like, wow, that was interesting. Did you write that, Kyrie eleison?
Oh, really?
Yeah, they were like,
oh,
that was really fresh. That was beautiful.
Yeah.
Okay, so that was great. And then there was another line where smoke was coming out of their ears. And they would walk up to me and they'd say, God saved me out of this Catholic church. Don't you dare bring it back here. Like, people were angry. And I had a lot of compassion for that. They had been wounded by their experience. And, had I been in a pastoral relationship with them, I would have loved to enter into, what are parts that need to be let go, what needs to be forgiven, what needs to be, But in that moment, I just said, I'm so sorry. But there was always a third group, and they often had tears in their eyes. And they would just say, thank you for reminding me that not all of my past was bad. And that was really meaningful, kind of the include and transcend, be able to bring the good parts of our past into a bigger future. And so maybe I share that story just to say it's been very, very mixed and specifically connected to people's past wounds.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, it's true for some people that even this, like the sights and smells of a certain kind of church, whether that be Anglican Catholic style or mega church preacher man, both can, if you've had a bad experience, have been something triggering. I hate that word. Maybe it's overused, but it can bring back the bad parts of it, not just the good. But I found that in my own liturgical seminary experience, the way I would describe it was I was like learning a new language.
Yeah.
It wasn't my mother tongue. So I was stumbling in it a little bit.
Yeah. I've just spent 2.5 years here in an Episcopal seminary, and I was lost every chapel for 2.5 years. It was just,
which book are we using?
When do I bow? But one thing along those lines, I think you bring up a great point about language. And I think when I started trying to bring more liturgical practices into an evangelical context, I would use all the liturgical words. And that was a tremendous mistake. Because the language doesn't matter near as much as the experience of it. So rather than saying, now we're going to celebrate Eucharist.
It was an obstacle for people.
Yeah. For some, the word Eucharist triggers Catholic so we just call it communion. At first I would talk about the liturgy we were doing. Well, then I finally said, well, that's a huge roadblock. So I just say this time of worship together. And so finding ways to keep doing the thing, but to talk about it in a way that's helpful to those who are listening. So it's kind of like communication 101, but it took me some time to get there because I think I burnt a number of bridges just by talking about it in unhelpful ways.
Well, one of the things you do talk about in your writing, or the analogy you're using in your book, The Eternal Current, you use this analogy of like saving us from drowning. Yeah. So can we go there? Like what, sure. If you're from the evangelical large church, maybe forget, it doesn't even have to be a large church, but a lot of people might come or have gone through a mega church. Yeah. What are on the Catholic Anglican side, there's some drowning too, but on the side of most of our listeners, they're on that evangelical side. So what are some of the things that people have been drowning in, or even just like the last year and a half, 2 years, and why we're doing this Fruit of the Spirit conversation, this whole series, is because people are drowning in some stuff. So let's talk about it. What are you seeing?
It's so true.
Yeah.
Man, you are a great question asker. It's almost like you've been doing this podcast for years and years and years. Right?
Well, it's trial and error. That's for sure.
No, that's great. I was actually thinking during that last part of the conversation, like, oh my goodness, this entire conversation is why I wrote the book, The Eternal Current, because it was just like, how do I, for so many of us. Let me speak in generalizations, but it's largely just my story and those I've been walking with. For so many of us, our experience of the faith feels good in some ways. Obviously, we all have been wounded by the church in ways. But the general tradition feels good, but just way too thin. You know, we can see the goodness, we can see the beauty, but it's about 1.5 inches deep. And when life's fine, it's great. Church is a way to connect with people we believe in, to remind ourselves that God loves us. That's wonderful. But when life gets complicated, or to use the water analogy, when the river starts turning into some of the rapids and things get deep, many of us have realized we don't have much to hold on to. And the simplistic ways of thinking about God run out of steam. And I think for me, more importantly than just the understandings in my brain, the concrete practices. I don't actually know what to do other than just like believe more, or, go to church again, or yeah. And I'll give you one example. In 2016, I don't know if you heard, but America had an election that was a little contentious. But in 2016, things were just getting so ugly. And I was leading a community at that time called The Practice on Sunday nights, and just realizing that, even in our community, there were, Clinton people and Trump people, and it was just so intense. And so we decided to add a concrete practice every Sunday for the whole year. And so as a part of our liturgy, we always had the confession, silence, and then words of assurance, as far as the east is from the west. And we said, let's keep doing that. But after the assurance, let us always add a prayer for one of our enemies. And because what we said, and I said this almost every week, like, how many of you know that Jesus said, pray for your enemies, love your enemies? Every hand went up. I said, keep your hand up if you do this regularly. Of course, and all of our hands went down. We know it, but we don't practice it. And the knowing doesn't change us, but the practicing changes everything. And so through that year, some nights we would do, I would say, all right, think of a world leader who feels like an enemy. Let's pray for them. One time we put up Hillary Clinton's face and Donald Trump's face up on the screen. And I just said, don't pray for the one you're leaning toward. Pray for the other one. Pray for their family. Pray for their physical health. I mean, it was hard. Like we hated it, but that's part of the work. And every once in a while, I would just say, all right, tonight is not about out there. Is there someone in your life who feels like an enemy? And would guide through a prayer. I bring that all up to say that helped us navigate the contentious waters better than 200 sermons about peacemaking. because that invited our hearts and our bodies and our stories to step into, God's redemptive healing flow. And then as we're practicing that, things can change from the inside out. And so again, I'm rambling a little bit, but to respond to your question, I knew my tradition taught me, don't hate your enemies, love your enemies, but it never gave me the tools to do it. It's like saying, make sure you're really strong, but it never taught me any of the exercises that would help me get strong. And so what's hard about that is it creates the knowledge, but does not give you the tools to do it. So it actually eventually becomes kind of a shame cycle. Well, I know I should love my enemies, but I don't. So just try harder. Well, that doesn't work. And so I've just seen so many of my friends come up to this either or choice that they feel, which is either I stay apart, like double down on this faith that hasn't worked for a long time, or I jump ship from the whole thing. And what I want to say to them, and maybe if you're listening, you feel that tension, like I either have to turn my brain and heart off to stay, or I have to close the door and leave everything. And what I want to say is those are terrible choices. And thank God they're not the only ones.
But they feel like it. They do feel like it.
They feel like the only choices. But I'm telling you, they are not the only choices. And thank God, because both of those feel deadening in a lot of ways.
I think, as someone who's led in church for a long time at this, relatively long for the age I am, my adult life, I even just the wrestling with my own complicity in that has been part of the journey. Again, we're talking about the fruit of the Spirit without actually talking about it, which I kind of love this. That when in what ways have I helped create that dichotomy for people that they had to either buy all in and I, you didn't do it consciously, but as a leader, you were involved in the machine that did this. So in what ways was I involved in that? Or what ways did I see this as an issue, but I didn't say anything? All these kinds of reflections you have to do sometimes on the other side. Yeah. Because one of the things that I think is so helpful, again, it's not my mother tongue, but what I like about the liturgical, like if you go through a service with an Anglican or Episcopalian church, you're going to pray and do things that you hadn't thought about praying or doing. Right. Like there's like, now is the time we're going to pray for our political leaders. Now is the time we're going to pray for the sick. Now is the time we're going to pray for whatever. And it's built into what they've got laid out for the morning together or the time together. And like, it forces you to do the stuff you forgot. It's like, as you said, like you wanted to, it's something you didn't want to, it's that you just never do it. It's almost like you're like, those like circuit training or the CrossFit, like these kind of things where you go in and they tell you what the workout is for the day. Yes. And the reason it works is because they're giving you over the course of a week or, going over a few months to this circuit training, you're That's getting right. every muscle worked. Yep.
It's a great analogy. And there's, obviously all analogies break down, but the church as gymnasium is really, really compelling to me. For many of us, church is classroom. What's happening this Sunday? Well, so-and-so pastor is preaching on this. And we go to hear that expert talk, Or for other traditions, church is like a performance hall. The worship band cranks it up to 11 and we have this euphoric experience. And that has, again, classroom has really important parts. Performance hall can really move us deeply, and that's beautiful. But church as gymnasium is really compelling. We come together to put Jesus' words into practice, to learn how to not just believe about, but do. That is really compelling to me.
Oh, I like that. Church as gymnasium.
Yeah.
So tied to that, you've just spent the last 2 years in study. I'd love to know any direction on this. Like, what is some stuff what is a book, a way of thinking, a practice that you're really excited about right now, from what you've been learning the last few years? Like, some of it's not that exciting. You do it because you got to do it for the credits for school. But there's what has been something that you're excited about right now? You want to talk about all the time.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you the thing. This is maybe a little different. Well, first of all, the best book I read was Tokens of Trust by Rowan Williams. And I'd read some Rowan Williams, but I've never read. This is a very simple book. It's kind of like an intro to Christianity.
And for people who don't know who Rowan Williams is, can you say who he was?
He was the Archbishop of the Episcopalian Church. Just a legendary theologian, preacher. And what struck me about Rowan is he loves his faith. He loves Jesus. He loves being a Christian. And the whole time, so much of seminary is deconstruction and, that probably didn't happen and Paul didn't write that, And Rowan Williams is like, let me tell you why this is the greatest story in human history. Let me tell you why, so that was just really, really compelling to me. The thing that, if you're asking what I want to talk about over and over and over and do, is the intersection, and it's some of what we're talking about right now. It's the intersection of traditions. So I grew up very evangelical. We had all the heart, but our roots were maybe about our roots didn't go down very deep. So now I come to this seminary, which is one of the oldest Episcopalian seminaries in the States, and it's historic and it's beautiful, and the roots go down all the way down to bedrock,
How old is the seminary? It's 18 something?
Yes.
Ish?
It's definitely in the late 1800s. I don't remember the actual
That's fine.
date.
It's not
My 9-year-old would know. He knows all the dates of all the buildings and everything. But what I'm experiencing is the depth is so beautiful, but they don't always know how to engage their heart and their kind of full self into these deep roots. It is, yeah. And, if the extreme of evangelicalism is we don't do anything unless we really, really want to, the only meaningful worship is if I really, really mean it, maybe the other extreme on the other side is doesn't matter if I mean it, doesn't matter if I feel it. I submit to this practice, and over time it forms me. And again, there's profound wisdom in that all of us evangelicals, and to be honest, that's kind of an American thing. Like, I just do it if I want, and I don't if I don't. But if you take it too far, it really ends up being, it hollows out the center. And so I am just feeling so compelled. It's really weird. I came to this Episcopal seminary pretty disillusioned with my evangelical tradition. And over the last 2.5 years, it's helped me realize a couple of the evangelical pillars. I believe in them more strongly.
Wow.
I want to be more evangelical in these couple ways.
Could you name one of them? What would be an example of something you love?
Absolutely. There's a couple big ones. One is that, let's see, how do I say it well? The cliche about it is it's all about an emotive experience. But I think the deeper truth is actually believing things matters. we don't just bring our brains and our bodies to worship. We bring our brains and our bodies, but we also bring our hearts and our stories. And it matters that it matters, and evangelicals are not too cool to wear our hearts on our sleeve. So I think that part of it's really beautiful, especially when inside this really robust and well thought out container. Right. And that's what we evangelicals don't always have. A lot of times we bring that emotive experience to a song that has 6 or 7 words for 5 minutes, Yeah. And so what I'm trying to explore is how do we bring our hearts into that really robust theology and framework and set of practices. The intersection, I'm calling it the intersection of evangelical hospitality with Anglican sacramental imagination. When those two things are present together, it can be really, really formative, can really help us. Does that connect?
Did you write a paper? Can we read it?
Well, what's interesting is I'm not talking about this publicly at all, but I'm actually working on ways to flesh that out. I want to write about it. I need to write about it, but more importantly, I want to find a way here in the city to flesh that out kind of collectively in a community. And so,
and even, you talk about Mars Hill, AJ Sherrill, who had been the lead guy there. He was on this podcast last season. Nice. And now he's moved from the mega church built in an old mall to leading an Anglican. I keep saying Anglican because here's the history lesson, everyone. Anglican and Episcopal are the same kind of church, except when America became independent from Britain, they didn't want to use the word Anglican. And Episcopal is the word for bishop in Latin? In some language I should remember. Yeah. And so we're the same, but we use a different word because Canadians still have the Queen on their... We still got the Queen on our currency, so we're fine with the word.
It's so complicated too. If you ask 5 Anglicans and Episcopalians to describe the similarities and differences, they'll describe it in 5 different ways. I mean, it's so complex. But
okay, but we got to land here before we go. Yeah. We got to talk about fruit of the Spirit because you're talking about feelings. What love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Those are feelings, but those are also practices.
Oh, yeah.
You've recently kind of taught around this, or you did a little bit of thinking on it. So, what do you want to say about what you've been discovering?
Well, our over the last 3 Wednesday nights, our church has been meeting in a more contemplative setup to specifically look at, especially in light of the season of Pentecost. And I think the central idea is just that the Spirit creates a certain kind of fruit in any person who makes space for this fruit to grow. And what I love about this idea is it's not the fruit of our hard work, and it's not even like we can't even earn or generate this fruit with religious work. It's not like God's looking at us and saying, all right, if you say your prayers 7 days a week, then I will. God is pouring this fruit onto and into I'm convinced, every single person on earth. The question is, do we make space for it? And that's what I love about spiritual practices. Spiritual practices don't convince God to do anything. God's already doing it. Spiritual practices don't say, hey, God, I know you're really far. Would you come close? God's saying, I've been here all along. But the spiritual practices help us open our eyes to that reality. And so with the fruit of the Spirit, it's the fruit of God's Spirit in our lives. It's what a life submitted and open to God naturally looks like. And so our work is to say, how do I get out of the way? How do I tend to the soil? How do I make space? For me, it's way more, how do I stop fighting what God keeps planting in my life. And how do I fight it? It's usually resentment. It's often unforgiveness. It's commonly like mindless distraction. I mean, how many games do I need to play on my phone as I'm watching, YouTube? There's nothing wrong with those activities, but there's a certain point where I know I'm avoiding my actual life.
Right.
And so yeah, the fruit of the Spirit, it's what God's naturally doing. It's who we will naturally become if we learn to live in the flow. And the question of discernment is, all right, what is mine to do to learn to live in the flow?
Live in the flow. Don't drown in it.
Yeah,
flow in it.
That's right. Yep. How do we learn to swim? And that's what these simple practices help us do. They don't keep us afloat. That's grace. Grace keeps us. Grace has invited us into the water. We don't earn our way into the river. We're already welcome. And in many ways, we're already in it. The question is, can we learn from the teacher of life? Learn from Christ how to not swim against the current, not get washed up on shore, but to get caught up in this epic, global, redemptive flow.
Yeah. Well, and there's a lot of rotten fruit out there these days that, what people are feeling, as you've said, this, you either have to double down and just like kind of ignore some things.
That's right.
And stay in the tradition.
Yep.
And even the word tradition is probably not the word evangelicals would prefer. So stay in your church, stay in your stay in the thing.
Yes.
Or abandon it completely.
Yes.
But I think there is this other thing which says, okay, let's trim back the bad fruit, and there's something else here.
Yeah. I won't tell the long story, but my first trip to the Middle East, Israel and Palestine, we learned from both sides. It was just this game-changing experience, but it really messed with me, and especially realizing my faith tradition's complicity in that conflict and all this. But I remember being over there, and I said, you know what? I don't know what to make of the whole story right now, but I'm just going to read the Beatitudes. I'm going to read the Beatitudes over and over and over. And I probably did that for a couple months. I didn't know what to do with Paul's writings. I didn't know what to do with anything. But I came back to Jesus' central teaching, the Beatitudes. And eventually that expanded to all of the Sermon on the Mount. And so I would even recommend to those listening, if you're feeling in that, do I double down on something that hasn't worked for a long time? Or do I jump ship from the whole thing? I wonder if you could even give yourself the grace to set some of those questions aside, to set the big story even aside, and just say, what does Jesus say about life? Blessed are the poor. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. Blessed are the peacemakers. And we realize, wait a second, Jesus was right about everything. Not theologically, well, yes, theologically, but not merely theologically. He was right about how the world actually works, which is blessed are the peacemakers, which is we love our enemies, don't try to defeat them, which on and on and on. So I would encourage anyone who's feeling that tension and unsure how to wrestle it to the ground to spend some time immersing yourself in Matthew 5, Matthew 6, Matthew 7. Jesus was right about everything.
Aaron, thanks so much. If people want to find you or find your corner of the internet, where do you want to send them?
Yeah. Well, my website is just myname.com, aaronniequist.com, and that has, links to all the socials and to the project that we've been working on for many years, anewliturgy.com, where we've recorded a number of these kind of evangelical Anglican liturgies. But yeah, aaronniequist.com has links to all the different things. So.
Thanks so much. I have loved chatting with you today.
Me too. Great to talk with you.